In the mid-16th century, the Ming dynasty was fighting an endless war along its southeastern coast. Official documents called it a scourge of Japanese pirates, villages burned, civilians displaced, troops deployed wave after wave with no end in sight. But according to the Ming's own records, the people actually coming from Japan may have made up only 20 or 30% of these so-called pirates. The majority were Chinese, merchants, fishermen, smugglers, pushed out to sea by their own empire's policies and then labeled enemies by that same empire. The most powerful among them was a merchant from Huizhou named Wang Zhi. He was not born a pirate, he was manufactured into one. The story begins with a door being shut. At the founding of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang imposed a maritime ban prohibiting private citizens from trading overseas. The reasoning was straightforward. The coast had been a stronghold of rival warlords, and maritime trade networks were entangled with forces hostile to the new regime. For a dynasty still consolidating power, security mattered more than profit. But a temporary security measure became a national policy that lasted 200 years. By the 16th century, the reality on the ground had completely changed. Vast quantities of silver from Japan and the Americas were flowing into China to purchase silk and porcelain. The maritime ban was not blocking a stream, it was damming a global river of wealth. Demand was surging while supply was forbidden. This was the simplest and most dangerous structure imaginable. Wang Zhi came from Huizhou, a region famous for its merchants. What he wanted to do was unremarkable: sell Chinese goods overseas and bring silver back. If the door had been open, he would have been nothing more than a successful trader. But the door was shut, which meant every transaction he made was a crime. He started as a smuggler. His fleet grew, his armed forces grew with it, and eventually he established a base at Hirado on the island of Kaisu in Japan, occupying a central position in the East China Sea's network of trade and arms. A Chinese merchant had built an empire of commerce and force on another country's coastline, not because he wanted to betray his nation, but because his nation would not allow him to do what he did best. Then he did something few people expected. He tried to negotiate with the empire. His terms were not complicated: open some ports, permit legal trade, and he would maintain order at sea and eliminate the truly uncontrollable pirates. This was not a surrender, it was a deal. Give me legitimacy and I will give you order. Hu Zongxian, the official in charge of southeastern military affairs, did establish contact with him. The war had dragged on for years, consuming enormous resources with no improvement in sight. If bringing Wang Zhi in from the cold could buy stability, the math made sense. A meeting was arranged. Wang Zhi chose to come ashore. A man who had held the initiative at sea for years left his fleet behind and stepped into the order of the land. What he carried with him was a willingness to cooperate, not a readiness to fight. But the decision was not made at the front line. He was arrested the moment he set foot on shore. Hu Zongxian himself understood the value of keeping Wang Zhi alive, but when word reached Beijing, a different logic prevailed. In 1559, Wang Zhi was executed in Hangzhou. Later accounts record that before his death, he said something to the effect of, "Killing me is easy, but after this, the sea will never know peace again." He was right. After his death, the forces he had held together splintered almost immediately, without anyone capable of controlling the whole smaller pirate bands scattered in every direction, their raids more random and harder to predict. The situation along the coast did not improve, it got worse. The empire had eliminated an adversary it could negotiate with, yet left behind a swarm of enemies with whom negotiation was impossible. Hu Zongxian's own fate was not much better. He was later impeached over political connections, thrown into prison, and died there. A man who had tried to solve the problem through pragmatism, and the man he had tried to bring in from the sea were both ground down by the same system. Was this really just a policy mistake? The empire was not trying to solve the problem, it was choosing which kind of problem was more controllable. The cost of Wang Zhi's proposed deal went far beyond opening a few ports. Once legal trade was permitted, wealth would flow to the private sector, to the coast, to people who existed outside the household registration and agricultural taxation systems. For a system built on control, an uncontrollable wealthy class was more dangerous than a band of pirates that could be suppressed by military force. The empire was not unaware that the sea held enormous profit. It had simply determined that the price of that profit, a loosening of control, exceeded the profit itself. Killing Wang Zhi was not an error. It was the system protecting itself. More than 20 years later, the pressure of reality forced the Ming to partially relax the maritime ban and permit limited private trade. The coastal economy recovered, and piracy declined sharply. History proved that the path Wang Zhi had proposed was viable all along. But that answer had been purchased with decades of chaos. Wang Zhi's story is not a story about pirates, nor is it a story about whether a policy was right or wrong. It is a story about how a system handles something it cannot digest. When the legal channel is closed, demand does not disappear. It only becomes harder to control. When a system chooses to destroy the person knocking at the door rather than open it, what is destroyed is usually not the problem itself, but the person who came closest to being the solution.